Hi guys, I'm back again today with another video. And this is why Britain is the center of the world. So we're gonna find out. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Click the bell button to know whenever I do upload a video because sometimes I do miss days. So the bell button will be helpful to know when to come back. But if you don't mind coming back every day to figure it out for your own, thank you. But yes, let's go straight into this video. Let's go to.
Here it is. Here's the original one. I think there's this misnomer that my orange coat is dead, but no, it's just dying quickly. There's just a good amount of this going on. But I think this thing has a couple more years for sure. So, this is my desk. I sit here all day and I work and I look at this map whenever I'm daydreaming. I just look at this map. I bought this map off eBay and it was in like an elementary school and now it's in my office. I notice something every time I look at it that kind of irks me. That something is this. This zero. This zero, which is not just one number, but it's actually a corresponding line that looks like this.
Is it the equator?
Let's back up here for a second. The Earth is divided into lines. Sometimes they're curved like they are on my map. And whether or not they're curved or straight has to do with this concept of projection, which I'm not going to talk about here. I've talked about plenty using a knife and a globe back in an old Vox video that I made. But just know that the Earth is divided up into lines, latitude and longitude lines, ones that go up and down and ones that go from side to side. All of these lines in the grid have a number associated with them. So for the up and down lines, there's a 0 point, and then anywhere to the right of that or east of that starts to go up from 0 to 180 with a little E next to it for east of the 0 line. And then everything to the left or the west of it has the same thing, 0 to 180 with a W for west. Okay? That center point is the 0 point from which all east and west things are measured. The same thing for these side-to-side lines. If you go up from here, you're going to start to get higher and higher until you get to 180 degrees north. Or if you go south, you will go 180 degrees south, which is the South Pole. Finding out where the 0 point should be for these horizontal lines is actually quite easy. The Earth has these two natural poles, which make for a natural top and bottom of the Earth. And halfway in between those two poles, you have this perfect center point, the equator, which is a very natural place to put this 0 point and to measure everything from. The up and down lines are totally arbitrary where you decide them. Like, who's to say that, like, it couldn't be right here in Russia and this could be 0 and everything could go west and east from here? Or Japan, for that matter. Well, in fact, a long time ago, that's how it used to be.
Really?
These maps with these grids were really, really important for navigating the world, and so everyone had to choose a 0 point. And most would just make their capital or their home base the 0 point. If you lived in Japan, you would just make Japan
Tokyo.
the 0 point, and the rest of the coordinates would be measured against that one 0 point, which was Japan. And same if you lived in France or Washington,
I
DC.
know for sure Ghana is on the equator.
This was fine because back then
we had to
countries kind of just fought wars and competed with each other. They weren't really collaborating
In
or
today's map,
aligning
at least.
or trading as much as they do today. And so everyone could just have their own maps centered around their place, and they did just fine. But
see.
then, around the 1800s, a few things started to happen that completely changed everything. First, countries and empires, instead of just competing and fighting with each other, started to actually say, like, we should align with each other and trade and be friends because that's better for everyone. Pair this with the fact that map making and sea navigation was becoming like a big industry. It was no longer just the king ordering maps to be made for their like expeditions, but now it was like private businesses going out and doing things that private businesses do. And so there was now like a demand for good seafaring maps. In short, map making was trending. Seems like a pretty good time to be alive. Okay, and there was one more thing that was happening around this time that was super important, which is this.
Oh, transportation?
Trains everywhere. Trains were just like popping up everywhere. And trains were also trending. People were now able to travel like across the country, not just like on their horses, but on this whole system of trains where you could buy a ticket, get on a train, and end up somewhere hundreds of miles away. And you know what trains run on, besides coal, is time. Timetables, schedules. How do you know when your train's gonna arrive, and when it's gonna leave, and when it's gonna get there? Time. Some universal set time. The problem is, back in the 1800s, there was no universal set time. Check out this piece of paper. Today, all of these cities and towns would be just on Eastern Standard Time, one time zone. But back then, every town had their own time, depending on when it was noon for them. If they were a little bit east or a little bit west of here, that would be different than in Washington, D.C. Total nightmare for trains. The lifeblood of trains is time. And this time mishmash
be
just
so
wasn't going to work.
complicated.
Okay, so
I
what
mean,
does
not
all
for
of this
people who
have
don't
to
go
do
outside of
with
their
this?
place.
Look at this guy. You probably don't know who this person is. I didn't know who this person was. He was the US president that no one remembers. This US president in the late 1800s saw a problem with all of this. He realized that having a bunch of different maps with a bunch of different 0 points based on whoever was making it was a problem. And he realized that not having a universal time zone or some sort of universal way of making the same time for everyone was also a problem. So he invited 41 countries to come here to Washington, D.C., where I live, and to sit around and think and talk about where this 0 point should be. Where should the center of the world be so that we can measure time as well as navigation? All maps could be normalized to this one spot. So after a moment of a bunch of white dudes sitting around in a room in Washington, D.C., which is kind of what's happening today in Washington, D.C., they came to a vote. And that vote, almost unanimously, said that the 0 line should be right here. This line, if you zoom in, goes right through London, England. It actually goes through a little outskirts town called Greenwich. Greenwich is the home of the Royal Observatory of the British Empire.
In the Philippines,
this would be
we call
the place
that
where
greenwich.
the prime meridian,
I don't know why.
or the 0 point for the entire world, east and west, would
Don't
start.
ask me.
Every country at the conference agreed that this should be the case, except for the Dominican Republic, at that time called Santo Domingo. They said no. They were the one country that didn't like this proposal. And France and Brazil actually abstained diplomatically, which was kind of them saying like, oh, we don't agree with this. France continued to make their maps with Paris as the center point, but eventually they got on board as well. So that gets to the crux of my big question of why the 0 right there, which is a bunch of people voted on it. But why were they so down with Britain having the 0 point being in the center of the world? Well, the answer is because it was 1884, and Britain was just really good at the ocean. The British Empire was by far the biggest, most powerful navy. They had the most experience with maps and ocean faring. And so it was kind of a natural choice to let Britain, the king of the ocean, have this center point. And from then on, maps started to be drafted with Greenwich, this Royal Observatory, as the center point for the east-west divide in the world. Over time, this exact point, exactly where it's drawn, has shifted a tiny bit because of better tools to measure things, and so it's actually not literally on the Royal Observatory anymore, but it's effectively in the same place that was drawn in this 1884 conference. But they also established that all time in the entire world would be measured against this same spot, Greenwich. Noon at Greenwich, at the Royal Observatory, would be the peg against which all other time was set. They called this Greenwich Mean Time. So you end up getting a map that looks like this. Zoom in and you see Greenwich is right here. That's GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, okay? You go west of here and you start to get GMT -1 or -2, -3. You can come all the way back to
when I cracked the code on how to read this, my world changed during that class. I remember I was in college. Yes, I'm so sorry. I had to be in college to understand the fudge this is. But I was in college. I think we were doing something. I don't know. We are doing something about time. And our teacher was like, "Yeah, what is the time if it is this time in US, what will be the time in Greenwich or whatever? What will be the time in Bavaria or something? What will be the time in Tokyo? What will be the time in Denmark? What will be the time in specific?" So that was part of our test, and we had to calculate, like, okay, if we're in America, it's this, so you have to do minus this or plus this. And I was like, oh, it's actually very easy. It's kind of faster than googling it, because then you don't have to sit down and type it. You just add this to that depending where you are in the world. It's actually very, very amazing. I was mind blown. That was one of my favorite subjects, to be honest, in my class.
Coast of the United States, and this time
Just
zone is Greenwich
weird.
Mean Time -5 right now. Sometimes it's -4 if there's daylight savings, and daylight savings is dumb and whatever. But
Yeah, I know,
you get the
right?
idea. The more you go west, you go back from Greenwich Mean Time. If you go east, it's the opposite. You go
Plus,
forward to Greenwich
yeah.
Mean Time. So if it's noon at Greenwich, then this next time zone, it'll be 1 p.m., 2 p.m., 3 p.m., 4 p.m., etc.
Makes sense,
So these
right?
time zones have been marked up in these kind of strange shapes. Eventually, if you go 12 steps away
Now
from
you can
Greenwich,
just get it on
12
your
time
phone
zones, you'll
and
end
put it
up
on a widget.
here at this mess. This mess is the International Dateline.
Dateline. Oh.
This is where Greenwich Mean Time plus 12 or minus 12 ends up at this line, which is where a new day starts. So let me give you an example of what this would look like. Imagine it's 4 p.m. in Greenwich, England, right here at this Royal Observatory. It is 4 p.m. GMT on May 28th. If anyone wants to send me a birthday gift, May 28th.
Oh,
May 28th.
it's his
It's
birthday.
May
Okay,
28th
fine.
at 4 p.m. GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. Sitting, chilling in the Royal Observatory, which I've never actually been to. I need to go to the Royal Observatory. I need
Where
to go
is
to the Royal
that?
Observatory. I'm going to do that this year, next year,
Okay.
at some point.
Good for you.
Okay, so it's 4 p.m., May 28th. Across the ocean here in Washington, D.C. at that time, you can see that we
What
go
is-
from 4 p.m.
One,
minus 5, so 11 a.m.
Okay.
Okay, so it's 11
it's
a.m. here in
27?
Washington, D.C. at that exact time on May 28th.
Oh,
Head
28th,
across
okay.
the United
Duh.
States to the west coast of the United States to Seattle or Portland, and right there it's 3 hours earlier than it is here. You're now at 8 a.m. So it's 8 a.m. here, it's still 4 p.m. in Greenwich.
Okay, it's still the
It's
same.
still 4 p.m. in London.
Duh.
Now you head into the Pacific Ocean, keep going west until you get to French Polynesia, at which time it's 5 in the morning. You're now GMT minus 11. It's 5 in the morning. And then you get right up to this messy line. If you were to be in the Baker Islands, which is like a U.S. like random uninhabited island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you would be at 4 a.m. So it's 4 p.m. over in Greenwich. It's 4 a.m.
So it's
on this
12
random
hours.
island in the Pacific. So then cross this messy looking line. It's still 4 a.m., but now it's the next day. It's May 29th at 4 a.m. Here in Fiji, at the same time, 4 p.m. at Greenwich, it's now 4 a.m. the next day, May 29th. So we went from being 12
it makes
hours.
sense if it's the other way around. Like if you're explaining to a child, it probably will make sense if we go this way to show it to them. But if we cross this line and you're showing to someone, maybe children, they'll be like, you are dumb. But it makes sense. It makes sense if it's not flat. If it's round, it makes more sense because the distance will look further, even if it's just the same thing. Anyways, I don't know. World is amazing and beautiful and confusing at the same time.
Behind Greenwich to being 12 hours in front of Greenwich just by going over this international date line.
Weird,
You
no?
could do this exact same thing going the other way. Start heading east and you see that it's 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. Head all the way over into Asia And now you're getting closer to seeing how that
You
4
see,
a.m.
like when we started here and you explain it to a child this way, they'll be like, okay, makes sense. But if you explain it to the other, you know what? I'm gonna shut up.
happens when you get over to Fiji. Now, the caveat to all of this is, of course, is that some of these countries switch by an hour for like daylight savings type things and whatever. But ignore that. Imagine there wasn't daylight savings. Right now, in this moment, where daylight savings
Daylight
is at least
saving
ending in the United
confuses
States,
everything.
this holds across the whole world. Someday I'll make a video about this whole messy debacle. But the point of all of this is to say that because of this conference in 1884 to reconcile train timetables and to make maps more uniform, we now have this navigation and time system that rules our whole world, and Britain is just sitting at the center of it, of course. The British Empire may have fallen and the world has moved on from Britain being the center of the world in a lot of ways, but it's still technically the center of the world in a lot of ways. I'm going to put some links in the description for some of these cool tools that kind of help visualize time zones if you're interested in that sort of thing. But yeah, my question has been answered. I actually didn't know the answer to this question, and I went on a deep dive, and now I know. So now I'll sit at my desk and I will know the answer to why that's 0, and I think that was worth it. So thanks. Big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is this giant repository of online tutorials where you can subscribe and have to everything.
Skillshare is not giving me any dime, so I'm so sorry, Skillshare, unless you want to. But until then,
some of the tricks and tips that maybe you didn't learn.
Okay, that's it. Yeah, now we know why it is the center of the world. It makes sense to have that central point so that everything is in place, everything makes sense in terms of timing, in terms of the timetable for transportations. Like, just imagine if we had our own map and then we were doing like air transportations. Doomed. You better walk and start swimming. But thankfully some white men decided to congregate together and make a decision, and it's helpful until today, right? Sometimes they do come up with some interesting things that help us in the long run. Okay, so anyways, thank you guys for joining. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.